Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. I wanted to discuss one of my favorite topics, alternative religious movements, and then, believe it or not, tie the subject into Maoism-Third Worldism, which I think it can be done quite easily. First, let me define what the term refers to. People who are not academics, and even more especially people who are not sociologists of religion, commonly use the word cults. In my field, that term is almost never used. Why? Because it is an insult. Now, it wasn't originally an insult, but it has become one. You say, "Oh, that is just a cult. You belong to a cult." See what I mean? Okay. So, using the word cult, although originally a fine term, has become very clearly a pejorative. And so in the sociology of religion, we try to avoid using it. Are there some people in my field who use it? Yes, but it is certainly not at all common. Um, so, alternative religious movements it is. Basically referring to relatively new religious movements, relatively new. Now, what relatively is can vary, and it depends upon the person who is doing the writing or the speaking. But I would say movements that began in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries could qualify under certain conditions. Basically, it is when a particular movement is new to the extent that it really has no precedent, meaning it is not a breakaway or a sect or a faction of some other religion. It is a new movement unto itself. That's pretty much what distinguishes a regular religion, whatever regular is, from an alternative religious movement. Um, Alternative religious movements can, in some cases, consist of more than one alternative religious organization. For example, you have the Hare Krishnas, which is a nickname for the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. But that term, the latter term, International Society for Krishna Consciousness, or ISKCON, makes little sense anymore because there are so many different sects of that movement. After A.C. Bhaktivedanta, Swami Prabhupada died, the movement fragmented, and now there are a lot of swamis all around the world who all claim to be leaders. Some of them are in good terms with other leaders, and some of them are not, which is, I guess, precisely what one might expect. Another example, uh, what used to be called the Unification Church, and I guess that term could still be used because that is not an official name anymore for an organization, commonly nicknamed the Moonies. Some Moonies find that to be disrespectful, and they prefer the alternative term, unificationism, which is what I generally refer to it as, because it's neutral. It is a reference to the theology and the beliefs of the people who follow or followed Sun Myung Moon, his wife, and the various factions of that movement which have broken away from it. Okay, so that is a basic overview. You have an alternative religious movement, but then in some cases, there can be different alternative religious organizations within that movement. So that's what I tried to point out just now. So let me go through a few, not all. I don't know how I could go through all of them. There are tons of them, but let me go through a few of them and then bring up a problem that basically all of them are facing. Okay, the Way International, a religious organization that was started by the late Victor Paul Werewolf. He is commonly referred to by his followers as Dr. Werewolf. Problem. And I don't mean to put him down. I once met him and he seemed like a fine guy. I shook hands with him. He looked at me and said, "Hi, Mark." And I expressed surprise. How does this guy know my name? And then I looked down and I saw that I was wearing a name tag. So Dr. Victor Paul Werewolf cracked up laughing, as did I. So at least he has a good sense of humor. I was kind of amazed. I thought maybe he had some type of magical gift that enabled him to know people's names. Well, not really, but I wondered why he knew my name. That's why. When Victor Paul Werewolf died, um, he was succeeded by a guy named Craig Martindale. Now, both Victor Paul Werewolf and Craig Martindale have been charged with abusing their followers. That's the best I can say, because neither one of them, to the best of my knowledge, has been convicted of anything. But a lot of people who are members of that organization made that accusation. As a result of that, the Way International soon fragmented, and pretty soon there were many different Way Internationals, and that's the way it is right now. However, I am not honestly sure how many of those factions still exist. Why? Well, because Craig Martindale is no longer in charge. And I think that the Way tried to get its house in order. So it is possible, although I'm not saying this as an absolute statement, but it is possible that those people in those sects that broke away from the Way International have now gone back into the Way International. There was a great deal of tension, especially when Craig Martindale was in charge. He condemned them, he attacked them, all the people that broke away. That did not create very warm feelings between Craig Martindale and the factions. Now, did the factions believe anything that was significantly different from what the original Way believed in? To the best of my knowledge, no. I have spent a lot of time studying the Way. I took their Power for Abundant Living course, course 1. There's also course 2 and 3, which I did not take. It is now called by a different name, slightly different, but I can't remember what that name is. But basically what it is a kind of neo-Pentecostal group. They practice speaking in tongues, they practice the interpretation of tongues, gift of knowledge, gift of wisdom, miraculous healing, and so forth. The distinctive characteristic of the Way is encapsulated in one of Victor Paul Werewolf's books called Jesus is Not God. Okay, so that pretty much encompasses it. They don't believe that Jesus is God. They are basically Aryans. And I'm not talking about Aryans, meaning the territory which is now basically occupied by Iran. I am talking about people of the so-called Aryan race. Questionable, but so-called Aryan race. That's not what this is. The Aryans were people who were followers of Arius. Arius was an early Christian leader who disagreed with the Trinity. And he said, no, there is no Trinity. There is simply God. And Jesus is the Son of God. The two groups that I am aware of that are Aryan are first, the Way International, and second, the Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm sure there are others, but those are the ones that I am familiar with, and I have studied both of them, including the Jehovah's Witnesses, which I have not mentioned before, in extraordinary depth. The Jehovah's Witnesses are also going through a kind of, I guess you could call it an identity crisis. I've known people who were Jehovah's Witnesses, and they were Jehovah's Witnesses when I knew them, who have challenged the official teachings of the Jehovah's Witness organization, or as it is called officially, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. Specifically, two things. One, the teaching against blood transfusions. And second, the idea that Jehovah's Witnesses are the only true Christians. Those are the things they have challenged. So, as to blood transfusions, the prohibition against blood transfusions, which exists among the Jehovah's Witnesses, goes back to the Old Testament prohibition against drinking blood. Now, that is easily challenged. Say, well, I'm not drinking blood, I'm getting a blood transfusion. And that would seem to me to be a very convincing argument. But it is one that the leadership of the Jehovah's Witnesses does not like very much, and so they have rejected it. Notwithstanding, there are some groups of Jehovah's Witnesses who mostly keep quiet, but not all of them. The one I met was not quiet at all. He was very open about his disagreement with the blood transfusion issue. He also was very open about his disagreement with the idea that the Jehovah's Witnesses are the only true church. So what has happened is that there have been various sects that have broken away from the Jehovah's Witnesses itself. Now, the Jehovah's Witnesses itself was originally a sect of a movement started by Charles Taze Russell called the Bible Students. It was one of many different sects. In the case of the Jehovah's Witnesses, it was started by Rutherford. But in any event, it is a good example of an alternative religious movement which has suffered the fate of many other alternative religious movements, which is factionalization. And I'm looking at my notes, believe it or not. You probably can see me looking at my notes. The Children of God. As far as I know, the Children of God, which was started by a guy named Moses David, very controversial figure. You may have heard of him and them. Moses David started this weird Children of God group, which is now called the Family. And they claim that they have given up their controversial practices, which were not secret. It's not like somebody discovered them. And they said, oh no, we don't do this. They acknowledged it. The main one they called flirty fishing. You might get an idea of what that means from the name. They would find attractive young women to be members of the children of God. Moses David, that is, would. And they would engage in what could only be called a kind of prostitution, hooking. They were basically hookers, except they were hookers who didn't charge any money. They would try to find, I guess, people they thought were susceptible to becoming members of the children of God, and they would have relations with them in an attempt to bring them into the children of God. That sounds kind of weird, especially for a Christian organization, but they did that, and they openly admitted it. In fact, I actually had, maybe I still have, a tract from the children of God in which they explicitly talk about their practice of flirty fishing and why it is a good thing and a way to spread the message of Christianity. So again, there were several legal problems that they run into, which you could probably understand. They escaped to Switzerland, but then eventually they came back to the US. I don't know how or why, but that doesn't really matter. As far as I know, most of them are back in the US, at least those of them who are still alive. That last statement, by the way, is a hint of what I will be talking about. Next is the Meher Baba movement. I have also studied that. I had two close friends who were members of that movement, followers of Meher Baba. His real name was Mirwan Shahryar Irani. He did not talk for several decades. That was supposedly a sign of his great spirituality. Not talking. Okay. Whatever you say, the person I knew mostly, and I won't mention his name, although he's deceased, was a pathological liar. He claimed to be a Baba lover, as they called themselves, but I don't think he really was. In my opinion, he used the Meher Baba movement as a way to find women, especially women substantially younger than himself, if you get the idea. And what he told me were a couple of fibs. One, that Meher Baba claimed that he was going to break his silence, which is a supposedly spiritual event. And what Meher Baba said, once I break my silence, the world will come to know that I am the one whom they have been waiting for. Okay, well, in any event, according to my friend, and to my knowledge, this is not true, so keep that in mind. This is not true, to the best of my knowledge. He showed up at an event, and the people who were the organizers looked all over for him, and they couldn't find him until they looked around, and they found him in a barn. And in the barn, he was totally naked, rolling around in cow dung. Now, you can imagine I was suspicious. Yeah, I was suspicious. But what do I care? I wasn't a Baba lover myself, so I just listened to him and let him talk about his guru rolling around in cow dung. This is so silly. He also told me a story, again, which I don't think really happened, that Mayor Baba was a passenger in the back of a car. He told the driver to drive faster and faster and faster, and the driver obeyed. Why? Who knows? If it happened, which I don't think it did. As a result of that, the driver died. And Mayor Baba, according to my friend's story, became a paraplegic. Again, what I did, because my friend ended our friendship under very suspicious circumstances, basically because I would not accept that he was a prophet, despite the fact that he had known for decades that I did not accept my friend as a prophet. Plus, followers of Mayor Baba were told by Mayor Baba not to claim to be prophets or gurus or perfect masters. When I discovered that, I pointed that out to my friend, and he said, well, yes, but I'm an exception. What else is he going to say? So, to my knowledge, neither of those things ever happened. Now, within the Mayor Baba movement, there have been, maybe there still are, I'm not sure, numerous organizations which have existed, including the Society for Avatar Mayor Baba, the Mayor Baba House, Sufism Reoriented, which all claimed to be groups based upon the teachings of Mayor Baba. So whether they are still active, well, I'm pretty sure that two of them are still active. I don't know about the third, and there are most likely others that I don't know about. But regardless, a really, really strange group, an alternative religious movement, again, with alternative religious organizations inside of it. Second, not second, next, the Baha'i Faith, a religion which was started in the 19th century by a man who used the title Baha'u'llah for the glory of God. That's what it means in Arabic. Now, are there sects of the Baha'i Faith? Well, it depends on who you ask. If you ask people who are members of the official original Baha'i Faith, they would say, no, they are not sects. They are covenant breakers, meaning they simply don't accept their legitimacy. But if you ask scholars like myself, we would say, yeah, those, they can call them covenant breakers if they want, but obviously they are sects. So yes, the Baha'i Faith is a new religious movement which started in Iran in the 19th century, which itself has, I think of how, about 12, I think. 12 is about right. About 12 different sects, or 12 different groups of covenant breakers, I guess, if you want to accept that idea. Finally, ISKCON. And no, I'm not swearing. ISKCON is an abbreviation or an acronym for the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, which I mentioned before, started by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. It itself, as I said, has numerous sects within it. It is a very controversial group for a number of reasons. One, ISKCON's interpretation of the Vedas, the Hindu scriptures, or the Vedanta scriptures, were very literalistic. So anything in the Vedas, he interpreted at face value, which results in some kind of absurd beliefs. I don't understand how anybody who is clear thinking could accept the kinds of things that were taught by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. But I'm not a member of ISKCON, so it's not for me to say. Again, there are a lot of factions of it, because again, when he died, the different Swamis all claimed to be heads of their own groups. Now, one of those groups was in West Virginia, and they were engaged in criminal activity. And some of them went to prison. Eventually, the temple, which they call it, that they occupied, was shut down, and it returned to the original International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Now, I could go on and on and on talking about Satya Sai Baba and a bunch of other people. Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, which himself, his own group has many sects. But what's the point? There are a lot of alternative religious movements in the United States and around the world too, but I am focusing on the United States right now. Okay, so today, the main problem that every single group I mentioned faces is this: they're dying out. They're dying out. Why? Well, there was a period of time, late 1960s, early 1970s, when there was a kind of attraction to alternative religious movements. A lot of people were joining them. I remember that time vividly. I used to go around visiting a lot of them. It was fun. As a future sociologist of religion, I found that to be immensely enjoyable. Now, some of those groups no longer exist, and some of them are the ones I just mentioned before, which still do exist, but in significantly reduced numbers. What's happened? Well, after that period of growth, that spurt in the late 1960s, early 70s, those groups basically stopped growing. For the most part, they grew and then they stopped. And that was the end of it. And there have been no successive waves of growth since that time. Well, what do you have as a result? You have religions which are made up predominantly, I wouldn't say exclusively, but pretty close to exclusively, of baby boomers, people of my generation. They used to go around exploring these different groups. And so, in other words, the result is that most likely within 10 to 20 years, the religions I mentioned will no longer exist in the United States. I think that is a fair statement. Now, I have broached that subject because I am kind of carefree, I guess, with members of certain of those NRMs, or new religious movements, alternative religious movements. And most of them will deny that, say, oh, no, 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 we're growing, we're growing. No, they're not. Now, am I going to say that to them? I'm not going to. There's no point. What's the point of offending people? I'm not going to offend people. But my point in discussing this was to show basically the state of new religious movements or alternative religious movements, both terms mean the same thing, in the United States today. Namely, that they're ending. They've passed their prime. I don't think that's offensive, is it? And so eventually, they will simply no longer exist. The older religions, like, for example, the Mormons, they still exist and they are growing. The Jehovah's Witnesses, also an older religion, it still exists. I'm not sure how fast it's growing, but it's certainly not dying out. There are two major reasons for that. Both the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses have what could broadly be called missionary activities. Now, among the Mormons or the Latter-day Saints, they call them missionaries. In the Jehovah's Witnesses, you guessed it, they call them witnesses. But either way, because of the fact that they engage in witnessing, typically knocking on people's doors, you probably have seen those young elders, those recent high school graduates that are bicycling around with their white shirts and ties, knocking on people's doors and trying to get them to listen to what they have to say. Those are the Mormon elders. Never quite understood that. I'll tell you a story. I'm somewhat hesitant to tell this story because I don't want to look like I am arrogant. I am not an arrogant person, but I do have a sense of justice, a very strong sense of justice and fairness. Two Mormons, LDS members, came into my apartment back when I lived in Kansas. And they introduced themselves as elder this and elder that, even though they were about 18 years old. And then I said, okay, and I am Dr. Foster. Now, would I ordinarily say I'm Dr. Foster? Absolutely not. I always refer to myself as Mark. But in a situation like that, I made an exception. And I introduced myself as Dr. Foster. And the weird thing is, they again called me Mark. I mean, what do you make of it? At that point, I kicked them out of my place. They simply stood there like frozen. They had no idea of what to do. And I said, did you hear me the first time? I asked you to leave. At that point, they left. So, but because the Mormons, the LDS people, have missionaries, because the Jehovah's Witnesses have witnesses, they are not dying out. That is not true with the other religions I mentioned. Now, why they don't imitate what the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons are doing, don't ask me. I have no idea. That's what I would do if I were in charge of one of them. I would say, well, look, we're dying out. They're not. Maybe we should copy them, but they're not copying them. And so they are on their way out the door. And pretty soon there will be no alternative religious movements or new religious movements like the ones I previously mentioned. They are literally fading into history. Now, How, you might ask, maybe not, but how, you might ask, does that relate to Maoism-Third worldism? This is my thought. You may or may not agree with me, that's up to you. What I think this shows is that here in the first world, especially here in the United States, everything that we do seems to fail. Doesn't matter, including starting new religions. There are so many contradictions in capitalism. So I would argue that these alternative or new religious movements are among those contradictions because they're dying out. Pretty soon they literally won't exist, just like the Freemasons won't exist, but for an entirely different reason, basically because young people simply don't want to become Freemasons anymore. So that's not exactly the same thing. But the Freemasons, yeah, they're not a religion. They're not new, but yeah, they're dying out too. So we have a tough time here in the US maintaining religions. They seem to ebb and flow. They start and they stop, and they start and they stop. But for the most part, the ones I mentioned, which is basically most new religious movements, started in the late 60s and the 1970s to grow, and that was the end of it. That was simply the end of it. They have not grown since that time. So again, do I have any hope? Well, maybe hope was the wrong reason, because what do I care? But do I have any hope? Okay, that things will change for them, that their fortunes will change, that somehow things will turn around for them and they will start growing? Well, as a sociologist of religion, putting on my sociology of religion cap, even though it says Antifa, not, maybe I should get a sociology of religion cap. Why not? I'm not sure if they make them, but I could have one custom made. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. There is no real incentive for people to join NRMs, new religious movements, anymore. These days, there are a lot of people who are interested in a kind of generic spirituality, unorganized spirituality. There are not that many people who are interested in new or alternative religious movements. It's simply not in fashion anymore. So as a result, these groups, which once captivated the attention of the American public, especially when Ted Patrick, who spent his career going in and out of jail, was going around kidnapping and trying to supposedly brainwash, reverse brainwash, or he called it deprogramming them, which, by the way, doesn't work. Why? Because brainwashing doesn't work. There's no such thing as brainwashing. It is mythology. You cannot brainwash someone. It's been studied. So if brainwashing doesn't work, then reverse brainwashing or deprogramming is not going to work well either. But I recall when that issue was one of the main subjects that people were discussing, whether or not it is right or it is legal. Legal, I think, is pretty clear it's not, or justifiable for parents to hire Ted Patrick or somebody like him. I actually know somebody who used to be a deprogrammer, and no, I won't mention his name, but I did know somebody who was a deprogrammer. No, he doesn't do it anymore. Now he's just taking in his billions of dollars. But if brainwashing doesn't work, then I don't think that one should expect that the programming would work either. And in fact, it does not. How can I say that with confidence? Because most people who were kidnapped by these deprogrammers and who went through this horrendous ritual of deprogramming, which often involved sleep deprivation, protein deprivation. I mean, it's evil. It's really evil stuff. There was one person who was kidnapped by Ted Patrick because his family was Republican and he had become a Democrat. I mean, that's how absurd that concept of deprogramming was. So, again, most people who were deprogrammed went back to the religion. Then again, on the other side, most people who convert to a new religious movement end up leaving that movement within a year. That may sound like a contradiction, but if you think about it, it's not. One deals with the issue of deprogramming, and the other deals with the issue of agency. People who join religions, well, it's kind of hard to keep them in because they really had no background in it. They weren't brought up in that religion. Their parents did not rear them in that religion. And so it's easy for them to lose interest and for them to leave and go on to, I guess, bigger and better things. And in fact, that's precisely what happens. And so the vast majority of people who joined these alternative or new religious movements left within a year. And those who remain today are arguably, like me, elderly. Yeah, I don't care. You can call me elderly. Some people don't like that word. What do I care? I'm an old man, an old fart, whatever you want to call me. I'm old. I'm old. I'm old. Old is fine. Old is better than being young. I hated being young because I was abused by my father and by other kids. So now I am happier. So again, I think that when we look at these new religions in the first world, and in particular here in the US, we can see the reason, or perhaps at least one of the reasons, why they have not grown since the early 1970s, as being a contradiction of capitalism. That simply it is virtually impossible for a new religion to start and to be successful in the long term. In the short term, maybe, but not in the long term. And so we are not seeing that many new religious movements, but we are seeing the end of some of the older new religious movements. And I think that process of demolition or destruction, or whatever you want to call it, will continue into the foreseeable future. For the time being, this has been Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.